Let's start from the beginning. I've heard you say I wasn't a very good cop. Why did you say that? Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, I sort of stumbled into policing by accident, really, because I went to university by mistake to study business studies, and I remember thinking, why on earth am I studying? Why did I choose to study this? So it was terribly boring. I dropped out of university and couldn't make my mind up what to do, and decided to flip a coin, and that took me into applying for the police. But only when I got into the uniform did I realise how young I was. I was 19, and I found out I was very sheltered. So for the first 2 years, I mean, I really struggled. You know, I struggled with confrontation. I struggled to learn in this sort of hyper macho environment. And to be fair, I really wasn't very good at it. I was just very slow to learn and develop, and you know, to be confident in a situation and manage conflict and manage people. It was a real stretch for me. So my first 2 years were hell. I only kept going for the first 2 years just to prove to myself I could survive that first 2 years. It wasn't a longing for a long career, so to speak.
You grew up kind of geeky, self-described geek. I can identify with that. Dungeons and Dragons, sense of honor, reading a lot, sense of duty. Is that why you became a cop in the first place? I mean, you said you flipped a coin, but there has to be a little bit more to it than that, or not?
No. I mean, it wasn't the reason why I went into the police. I didn't have a sense of duty or a sense to fight the good fight or anything. It was just, it seemed like an adventure. It just seemed like something that would be different every day.
Right, okay.
I developed my sense of duty really after 3 or 4 years in the job. You know, I realised, you know, I had a responsibility here. I wasn't just surviving. I actually had to try and do everything I could to do the right thing, and that sort of value system was rooted in all of the geeky literature that I read and all of the sort of, you know, stuff that I was into as a kid, really.
Did you fit in well with the cops? Because a lot of times self-described Dungeons and Dragons geeks don't always fit in with these sort of dude bro macho cop culture. Maybe it's different in the UK.
No, there was definitely an element of chalk and cheese with policing.
Of what?
Chalk and cheese. That, you know.
What is that?
It's
that's got to be a British term.
Yeah, of course. I always forget when I'm speaking to Americans. I come out with all these sayings, and I forget that they're very British. Chalk and cheese can look quite similar.
I mean, I love it, but I don't know what it means.
The chalk and cheese can look quite similar.
Oh, chalk and cheese.
Chalk and cheese, yeah.
Okay.
They can look very similar, but you know, you find out that they're very different when you bite into them. So yes, there was an element of chalk and cheese with me and police officers. I remember one saying, "Well, what football team do you support?" As in soccer, for you Americans out there. Yeah. And I says, I don't follow football at all. And he looked at me dead seriously and said, "Well, what do you talk about?" So that, you know, there was a sort of cultural thing there. I'm not suggesting that all police officers are boring and just into football, but not many of them wanted to talk about music and fantasy fiction or science fiction, you know, those kind of things. So yeah, it was a little bit of difference.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, so you're not really fitting in well with the police, but maybe this makes you good at your job later on, or at least less detectable as an undercover. Tell me about the first domestic disturbance call you went on with the guy that's chasing you with the knife, because this is kind of a ridiculous image in my head.
Yeah, it was one of the first calls I went to when I was allowed out on my own without my tutor stood beside me. And I was on foot, so I was on my own, on foot patrol, and I got sent to this domestic dispute. And it was a guy actually that I knew because in company with my tutor, we'd arrested him for drink driving, and I think he was on bail for that at the time. And there was this domestic dispute at this house. It was in the daytime. I knocked on the door, and there was just screaming. The most just constant screaming. He was screaming. His wife was screaming. And I went in, and he went, "It's you. I recognise you." And he reached for a Stanley knife, a short, very sharp, razor-sharp blade. And he started chasing me, because I'd got into the room. He started chasing me. And I'll describe the room. It was like there was hardly anything in the room apart from one large sofa, and a television. And to memory, I don't think there was anything else, but the sofa was in the middle of the room. And I ended up being chased around this sofa by this guy who was drunk and shouting and screaming at me, but chasing me with his knife. So I got, we don't have guns in the UK. We don't carry them as police officers. And if they'd required me to carry one, I would have resigned. There's no way I would carry one. So I got out my little stick that they give us for protection, a little truncheon. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do with that? So I carried on running. Anyway, he stopped at one point and he got this knife and he slashed his wrist. And then he slashed his other wrist and said, right, you're next. And then carried on running around after me. But he was getting tired and he was drunk already. And obviously, he was starting to realise that he was bleeding. And he was bleeding quite a lot.
Yeah.
And by this,
as one does when you slash both of your wrists and start running.
Yeah. So, and by this time and by this time I'd remembered to radio for backup as well. And so eventually some backup got there. But yeah, that was an interesting first solo domestic dispute. Yeah.
This is early in your career, and I would imagine at that point do you kind of think, okay, this is what I'm in for? There's gonna be more like this, or are you thinking, this is a one-off, I just got lucky?
I think it was a clear indication that every day is going to be unpredictable, but there was still a lot of the unpredictability that still at its core appealed to me. I was just struggling to be good at dealing with it, if that makes sense.
You ended up on the drug squad during the early 90s, which I don't know if it was the same there, but that was the crack epidemic here in the United States. There was a moral panic about this. Tell me what's going on around this time in the UK for the police.
Yeah, well, the reason I got a drug squad attachment was because of that moral panic. And the problem we had in the UK is that we hadn't got any crack until the early 90s. So we were having all the tabloid newspapers telling lurid stories about how crack cocaine was destroying neighborhoods in America. We had repeated images of Nancy Reagan telling us that one smoke of crack would get you addicted for life. And, I believed all that rubbish at the time. But that was what got me a drug squad attachment, because suddenly we got crack cocaine in our inner cities, and the public was already whipped up into a frenzy of fear by the newspapers and by the media. So this created a very rapid political response. The government instructed the police to make drugs its number one priority, above anything, above terrorism, above domestic violence, above anything, and injected loads of money into policing to do that. And so that's why I, after only 4 years in, got this attachment to the drug squad, which I thought was quite unlikely at the time, to be honest.
Tell me about your first undercover drug buy. I know this is like kind of the beginning of your undercover work in the UK, right? Or at least drug undercover work in the UK.
Yeah, well, I mean, we had undercover work and we'd had it for decades, but only the high-end undercover work,
sure.
The verging on spy type undercover work. But the idea of doing undercover work at a low level, at street level, this was entirely new. I know it had happened for a long time in the States, but we hadn't done it. So I remember I was only 2 weeks into my attachment, and one of the drug squad said, "Do you want to have a go at buying some crack?" I thought, okay. And he gave me a £20 note. They quickly set up an observations point, and I was pointed to this terraced door. And so I went to knock on this door, and this huge guy opened and looked at me and said, "Who are you? You're not a student, are you? Fucking hate students." And then at that moment, it occurred to me I actually didn't have a cover story. I had no idea who I was. No idea. But I thought, well, that'll do. Yeah, I'm a student. And, of course, then I was questioned, well, are you stupid? I've just told you I hate students. But he found it funny. And he quite quickly agreed to sell me a rock of crack cocaine, gave him my £20. And as I was turning and walking away, he said, "You take care now. Don't get yourself arrested," which I thought was quite sweet of him, really. And so I walked back to the drug squad and said, "Yeah, I've got it. I got my little stone." And that day defined, well, the rest of my life, really. It's taken me on that long, convoluted journey, which has brought me here to speak to you. But I think the important thing to note from that day was that actually it was really easy. I just knocked on someone's door. He didn't know there was going to be a cop stood on his doorstep at all. So it was easy. But of course, my presence in that marketplace changed things for everybody, because he went to prison and suddenly everybody knew there was a new tactic on town.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of that movie with Ricky Gervais, The Invention of Lying. Have you seen that movie?
Yeah, very clever script, that. Very good. Yeah.
It is. It's a really just you don't say this about movies very often these days. Very unique storyline, right? I mean, the idea behind it, for those who don't know, Ricky Gervais, he just lies and nobody expects it because there's no such thing as lying in whatever universe he's in. I can't remember the exact reason that this is the case for him. So he's easily able to manipulate people into doing what he wants. And he says, oh, yeah, after you die, you go to heaven. And people are like, wow, you know what happens after you die. So he's going on a world tour, all these talk shows, among other things, where he's the man who knows what happens after you die. And nobody expects that he's just making things up. And the reason that this is a parallel for me is nobody's expecting you to be a cop. There's no like, hey, you're not a cop, are you? There's no suspicion, because no police officer during this time is going and trying to buy drugs from drug dealers and then arresting them. It's just not a thing. So you're playing on easy mode for the next bit, I would assume.
That's very well put, actually. I'm gonna steal that. I hope you don't mind. I'm on easy mode. That's a very good a good way of putting it. But of course, it developed through the levels, so to speak, very quickly, because the drug squads, their eyes lit up. This was a way of coping with the pressure of needing results from above. This was suddenly a way of getting lots of results. So in no time at all, I was working weeks and weeks at a time, and then in no time at all, it was no less than 6 or 7 months I was doing at a time. And I was being loaned out to all of the other drug squads all over England, and it escalated very quickly. And it felt like I was struggling to keep up with those level progressions, if that's the way to put it.
Sure, yeah. To drag the metaphor around, when you bust someone, don't you have to reveal your identity at some point? Like either when they get arrested, they figure it out, but also, is there not a trial where it's like, yes, I bought crack from him and I'm a police officer, and they're like, oh, doesn't that compromise your ability to go undercover again?
Well, I mean, maybe I pushed my luck, maybe because I did it over the space of 14 years. But I was traveling some distance in between each operation, and I would have a completely different legend. And when I gave evidence in Crown Court, I was always behind a screen. So no one could see me. I would continue to use the pseudonym, the same pseudonym. In fact, there was, I remember when I gave evidence in the Crown Court in Leicester, in the city of Leicester, there was a credible threat to my life. So I was having a full surveillance team following me away from the Crown Court to make sure I wasn't being followed, and I was being smuggled in at strange times and in disguises and things like that. So. Yes, but no photographs of me got out, and I was successfully moving around from place to place, and obviously the personality I was portraying at each place was different enough, so I stayed safe.
See, we don't have that here. You have a constitutional right, essentially, to confront your accuser, and so you have to show up and be like, I'm the one who saw him, and they have, you have to look them in the eye. There's no screen. Maybe there's certain circumstances for minors and things like that, but you're pretty much burned when it comes to this in court here in the United States for different reasons that probably have persisted for a good reason. How do these undercover operations work? I assume you got to amass some evidence. Do you arrest everyone in one go when you're trying to go up the chain? I assume you didn't just stick with low-level dealers, right? You're trying to pull the whole weed out.
No, I mean, the job would end when you've got a reasonable chance of, when you can be sure that you've caught everyone you're going to catch, and then everyone's arrested in one go. And just to give you an idea of how it's set up, so I would be loaned out by a specialist covert policing unit called the East Midlands Special Operations Unit, and I would be loaned out to a particular constabulary, but they would have to set everything up ready for me. So I would have to have a team around me. So I would have to have this is the way how it got developed anyway. I would have to have a techie guy, an intel officer, statement person, senior investigating officer. All of these team around me would have to be set up, and they would have to be removed completely from normal policing. So they'd be in a separate location, completely cocooned, not allowed to speak to any of the other police at all during the operation. And they would all be sat down the day before I got there, and they would be given a briefing. They would be given what's called a lawful order. And they would be told, you cannot ask the undercover operative his real name. You cannot ask him where he's from. Don't ask him any personal details. And if you do, you will be disciplined. And they had to sign the receipt of this lawful order. So everything was cocooned completely, totally separate from normal policing. And of course, the reason for that is to protect against corruption and to protect my life. But I think it's really worth pointing, in fact, it's incredibly important to point out that those kind of safeguards do not exist for anything else, only drugs investigations, which I think is an important observation.
Because of
corruption.
Yeah, because of corruption. Yeah. Like they acknowledge, by doing that, they're acknowledging we can't really trust our own cops because if we could, we wouldn't need this system, this silo system.
Exactly. And that's a nationally adopted model that has to happen for those kind of operations. So that system in of itself is proof of the level of endemic corruption within policing as a result of our current drug policy. But you asked me a question about how, do you want me to tell you about one of the operations?
Yeah, I've got a bunch of questions about a lot of the operations. I'm curious about how the operations work and, what the largest bust is in terms of arrests. If you're pulling out the whole weed, how big is that weed?
Well, I suppose the biggest operation I did, at the end of the operation, after 7 months, there were 96 people that I'd gathered evidence against.
Oh, wow.
Six of them were the main targets. And the main targets were a very infamous gang called the Burglar Boys, which is it's a very British name for a organised crime group. I know
it really is. It's so silly, but like it's ironic, right? Because the people are no joke. They probably slice people up with hot knives or something, but they've got this name that sounds like a satirical rap band or Saturday Night Live, comedy sketch, like. If you ran into a gang named the Burglar Boys, it would be from like an 80s music video or something. It's not, and then here they are in the UK killing people, probably.
Yeah, I mean, the six main targets in that gang. One of them was implicated in 7 different murders. He was the person who provided the machine guns for a double murder of 2 young women. But the intelligence before this was horrific. They were using routine sexual violence, gang rape, kidnappings, maimings, all of these kind of things. So they were as brutal as people as I've ever met. So I built my legend with these particular people very, very carefully and in a very considered way. And in order to do that, I went into the town where they were operating, and I looked for the most vulnerable people to manipulate. The most vulnerable problematic drug users. And the reason I look for the most vulnerable is because the most vulnerable are the easier to manipulate, and if that sounds ruthless,
sure.
Well, of course it's ruthless. That's the nature of the work, and that's what the work became. But the most vulnerable people tend to have the best connections, and I can make them do what I want, really. I can make them jump through hoops and get them to introduce me directly to these various dangerous individuals. But that operation took 7 months. As I said, there was 96 people that we had evidence against, the 6 main gangsters plus 90 of their support staff, the sex workers they were using, the runners,
wow.
People stashing. But that one was unusual because after those 7 months, I knew I'd caught everybody. There was no one else to meet. There was no rumours of anybody. There was no nicknames, no names to people I needed to still meet. I'd got everyone's phone number. All of the phone data was all linked up. everything was corroborated. It was like, it was evidentially tied up almost with a perfect bow. And so I thought this is going to be spectacularly impactful. So for the arrest phase of it, when I'd finished, so what happened is once I did my last day, then they go into the arrest phase and I completely step away. And there'd be sort of evidential packages created for each target. But there was hundreds of police involved, hundreds. All of the surrounding police forces were brought in to help. But after the dust settled for that, I spoke to the intel officer just afterwards, and he said to me, yep, we managed to interrupt the drug supply in the town of Northampton for a full 2 hours. So after 7 months of work, and, I was convinced I was going to die on multiple occasions in that operation. In fact, at one point, they stripped me at gunpoint. Well, I say point. I mean, he left it tucked into his trousers, but he showed me the gun to make sure I knew he meant it. So, I thought I was going to die then. I was stripped at gunpoint. I was assaulted. It was, every single day of that operation, I thought I was in immediate danger of violence every single day. And all of the resources that went into me and the other cops for the sake of interrupting the drug supply for 2 hours. I mean, it's astounding, really. But that is the reality of drugs policing at every level, that cops are really, really good at catching drug dealers. They are really good at it. They're especially good at it in the UK. They're especially good at it in the USA. But that's a significant part of the problem. Because all you do is you create an opportunity for somebody else. Now, I don't know that it's the Burger Bar Boys' infamous rivals, the Johnson crew, another very British name, I suppose. I don't know it's the Johnson crew that took up that opportunity that was created for them. But you can sort of picture the scene, can't you? The rival gang are all sat round. One of them comes into the room and says, "Put the call in, boys. We're going to make a fortune. Guess what the cops have done for us? They've locked up the Burger Bar Boys. Mm-hmm. Yay." And the thing is, no one goes without their drugs from any police activity in the drug market. No one. And the police might be really good at catching drug dealers, but the size of the market stays the same, which means all the police are doing is they're changing the shape of that market, constantly changing the shape of that market. It's never an improvement.
Right. You're just squishing something from one end of the container to the other. I usually have better metaphors. This is not one of those times. But you're really just you're pushing the peas around the plate. Man, I just want to comment on a few things here. 96 people in an organization. One, that's a huge bust. But two, that's a big organization. Managing 96 people would be a nightmare. When they're all criminals, sort of by definition, it would be even more difficult, I think, to manage an organization of that size. And yeah, you're right. The rival gang probably rolls in and says, all the competition's gone for at least a few months. Roll out all of our runners on all the corners, recruit some new folks, call everybody you know, and we're just going to take over that network. And of course, the word is going to spread like wildfire among the users because people are going to go, did you hear our dealer got busted? Don't worry, the Johnson crew's on it. Just go to the same place where you bought yesterday, and there's going to be a different guy there with a different colored hat, and you're off to the races. And it strikes you as how professional these organizations are, and the cops might be great at their job, but it doesn't make a difference because we're not really attacking the proper part of the problem. I'd love to go back to manipulation for a second here. What made you so good at weaponizing your empathy, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that comes back to one of your earlier questions about whether being a geek actually helped me with undercover work, because I wasn't a very good uniform cop, but I did take to undercover work like a duck to water. I really did. But in order to learn and adapt, because I was given no training, so that I wasn't trained to do it. I was literally just making it up as I went along, and I helped to design the national training 4 years after I'd been doing the work. So there was no training. So for me, it was about learning about the people around me and and listening to them and actually trying to understand what they were feeling, what their motivations were, and that, you know, that's empathy, isn't it? It's trying to stand in their shoes. And I went into that work with a very prejudiced view, a very stigmatized view of people who use drugs problematically. I looked down on them. I really did. I saw people who were using heroin problematically as someone who were just stupid enough to have tried it in the first place and just didn't have the willpower to get out of it, and tough, you know. That was just awful judgment. But when I realised, I spent a lot of time trying to understand people, and every single person who was using drugs problematically, I mean every single one of them I spoke to, was trying to deal with some emotional pain. And almost all of them was from some kind of childhood trauma. You know, I spoke to one young woman who went by the name of Uma, and she said, well, I can stop taking heroin, and every few weeks I do. I come off it so it gets cheaper, so I can bring my tolerance down for a couple of weeks. She said, but the trouble is, after 2 weeks off heroin, I start to feel suicidal again, because I can remember how it felt, the touch of my uncle's fingernails when he used to sexually abuse me as a little girl. And so for her, using heroin was a very rational decision, actually, very rational. And so it is for a great number of people. And so in feeling that sort of gut-wrenching understanding of their pain and being able to very quickly see that pain in the faces of other people and seeing so many traits in common, you know, I felt immersed in understanding them all. But that's the twisted thing, really, and that's why I sort of refer to it as weaponizing empathy, because empathy traditionally, that kind of level of understanding and appreciation for other people's struggles, is usually, it's used for good. You know, if you're going out of your way to learn about people, normally there's a positive outcome, or there's something positive you can do about it. But I was doing the opposite. I was doing it so that I could manipulate them and get them to do what I want, which, you know, with every passing year, that actually became emotionally really difficult for me. So I was quashing my own feelings in this regard, and this growing sense of guilt that, you know, these people are hurting and I'm doing nothing to help them, and I'm doing everything to hurt them, actually.
Right, you're taking away their source of medication, you're possibly putting them in prison, you're pretending to be their friend. I mean, it's kind of awful if you think about it, and I'm sure that you have.
Well, it is. But the thing is, but because I believed in the work, I believed in the end result.
Right.
I believed in catching the gangster at the end of the operation. Like, I was constantly justifying it to myself, so I would push down my doubts. But it got to, I mean, one particular person I'll tell you about, I got to know, and this was for an operation in the city of Nottingham. And this guy was really useful to me because he was on bail for dealing heroin, and he was connected to the periphery of a cartel I was trying to investigate called the Bestwood Cartel, headed by this very infamous British gangster called Colin Gunn. And this guy, Cammy, I mean, I spent loads of time with him. I learned that his particular emotional pain was the abuse that he got from his father. And I remember, I'll never forget him saying this. He says, "Oh my dad used to beat me, but only when I deserved it." You know, and those kind of phrases really stuck with me. So I got to know Cammy. But the thing is about Cammy is he was really good company. He had this really brilliant observational wit. You know, we could sit together in the street and watch someone go by, and he would just find some piece of comedy in characters. You know, just characters walking by, and it was an appealing trait, you know, and he was good fun, and I enjoyed his company. I went shoplifting with him, stealing from shops. That was great fun, actually.
Yeah, I bet, especially because you know you're not actually going to get in trouble for it, so it's kind of a thrill that's
exactly
in a way quite harmless.
Yeah, I mean, we take it in turns to be lookout, and anyway, I won't go into that too much more. But but the point is, at the end of that operation, again, it was a 7-month operation. He did introduce me to a sort of lieutenant of one of the main gangsters. But at the end of that operation, he was also arrested. He was committing offences on bail, which I recorded evidence of. So he ended up getting 3.5 years in prison. But when he was in the police station, He ended up being on minute-to-minute watch, suicide watch. And the reason that he was suicidal, as he told the interviewing officers, was because he thought I was his one friend in the world. He thought that he'd never had anyone he could properly talk to about how he was feeling. Never. And he thought finally he'd found someone who was a friend and who he could get on with. And for him, that my betrayal was just the last straw in an extremely difficult life. And so it tipped him over and he became suicidal. Now, I heard about that again from the intel guy. He was just filling me in with, what had happened. Not quite sure why he told me that, but when he told me, I mean, I can remember it really clearly. Just my world just started spinning. I felt literally nauseous and churning butterflies, and I just felt horrific.
Yeah.
And so that straight away I thought, well, I can't do this anymore. I cannot do undercover work anymore. It's just too emotionally difficult. But I got myself manipulated back into it in order to do the operation with the Burger Bar boys, which of course I'm probably jumping around a bit here for you. I'm sorry, but for the
okay.
So I got
I'll handle that.
I got talked into it to going back to do the operation for the Burger Bar boys, because the problem is by that point I'd become quite a sort of troubleshooter. So if there had already been 2 undercover operatives trying to get close to the Burger Bar boys and they hadn't managed it, so I was persuaded to go into that, because that had become, my role to do the difficult operations.
Right. You had the skills to really sort of blend in, and it seems like you started to realize when you're policing, when you're working with these vulnerable people, do you think it's fair to say that one of the worst things to happen to these people was not necessarily the drugs or the drug addiction? Of course, those are terrible, but it seems like meeting you is actually up there alongside those tragedies. Yeah,
that's well put as well. Meeting me really was the worst thing that could possibly happen to these people. The second worst thing was to be exploited by, and manipulated by the gangsters. But meeting me as the cop, they're looking at time inside. And, not only are they looking at time inside, but some of the people over time have been desperate not to get a prison sentence that's too short. Because if they don't get a long prison sentence, then they're terrified they're going to be accused of being a police informant, and they're not even going to come out of jail in one piece. I remember actually Cammy, the chap I was talking about, he actually got arrested after I'd been manipulating him for about 3 or 4 weeks, and he was becoming really useful to me. But he got arrested, and I'm thinking, oh no, he's on bail. He's going to get remanded in custody. He's not going to get bail. He's not going to come out. I'm going to have to start working on someone else. This is going to set my job back. And then I saw him later on that day. He came out into the street. I thought, wow, how on earth did he get bail? How? But I was stood talking to 3 of his other mates, and they're all whispering like, how did he get bail? How did he get bail? And he came up and he said, I can't believe what's happened today. He says, I can't fucking believe it. He says, I was in the cell, and the 2 bloody drug squad came in, and they started offering me a deal, didn't they? They said you need to start informing for us. And I said, no way, man. And then they said, you can either start telling us things, or we'll let people on the street know that you did.
Oh, man.
So I said, well, God, wow, man.
So you just have no choice?
So I said, so what did you do? And he says, well, I told them to stick it up their arse, he said. There's no way I'm going to start grassing for them, because I don't know, do I? One of them might be working with the same people I work for.
Jeez.
It's messy.
What a terrible bargain. That's so messy. Good way to put it. I want to go back. You mentioned your skill set. You were a problem solver. I've heard you mention that organized crime, exploits people from dealers to users. You were learning about how these people were exploited. Did that give you more skills to pretend to be exploited in the same way and thus blend in? Does that question make sense? It's a little convoluted.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It did, because I had to play a role. Although I have to emphasise, I'm not an actor. Undercover work is not acting. I definitely wouldn't have the skills for acting. I had to play a different version of myself. But sometimes that version of myself would be the submissive, exploited character. And that would mean that I would allow myself to be exploited, to be, have a weight laid on. When they say, here you go, there's a quarter ounce, you can go and sell that, and you pay me when you've sold it. There was sometimes that was the kind of relationship you had to have with the regional managers, so to speak. They're just a slightly step up from the street level. That's where the opportunities could come from sometimes. Yeah, that's right.
I am curious about the shoplifting and doing other crimes as an undercover. How does that work? Because I've seen court documents telling people what crimes they can and cannot do. When I interview mobsters, they'll send me their court documents, and it's like, you're basically approved by the FBI to engage in illegal gambling and extortion as long as it doesn't involve violence, or you can possess certain stolen merchandise or something like that. Right? They're very kind of detailed on what you are allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. Do you have to? Is it the same in the UK? Do you have to sort of get approval? Like, okay, you can shoplift, but you can't punch the store clerk in the face when you do it. Of course, you just you can act as a lookout for someone else to shoplift, etc. How does that? What are the forget that. What are the crimes that are the most fun to commit? Was it shoplifting? Or was there something else that was better?
Well, I mean, I've broken into a car. I've done shoplifting, but that's the only kind of things that I actually did. I mean, okay. At that point, there was a sort of very common sense approach that I knew that anything I did might get questioned in a preliminary hearing, and but the concern would be whether the evidence would be admissible as a result of what I'd done or not done. So I had to just think through a pragmatic and common sense lens. But as for stealing, if I've got the intention of eventually returning the goods or the value of the goods, it's not stealing anyway, because my intent isn't there, so it's not theft. So I was quite comfortable, really. I didn't really have those kind of strictures or agreements beforehand. The only agreements really that we had, and I used to get read this by instructions from the senior investigating officer before deployments, was a list of things that I must not do. And the number one of those was, I must not act as an agent provocateur, that is, to cause somebody to commit a crime that they wouldn't have already have committed, or to commit a more serious crime than they would have done. That's to be an agent provocateur.
Right,
that was the absolute. You must never do that.
That's entrapment.
Yeah, that's entrapment. You must never ever do.
We call that entrapment. I don't know if you. Yeah. That makes sense. And by the way, if you are thinking of shoplifting and then using the rationale, I intended to give the goods back later, you better be a cop if you're going to go with that line of reasoning, because I don't think that works very well for the rest of us.
No, I don't think it would. But there's actually a very sinister thing happened in the UK just last year, and we have a new Act of Parliament called the Covert Human Intelligence Source Act. And it actually gives a blanket immunity to all state operatives to commit crimes. Blanket immunity. And that includes police informants, which is really sinister, really undemocratic, and that's just happened.
Explain that a little bit.
Well, it's an act of parliament, which means that undercover cops are allowed in advance to be forgiven for any crime that they commit whilst being deployed. That's it.
Not any crime.
Well, it's all in there, including agent provocateur. They even wrote in that now an undercover operative is allowed to be an agent provocateur as well. That honestly, it's a blanket immunity for crime. That's
a terrible idea.
Yeah, it is. It's extraordinary. But we have extremists in the charge in the UK at the moment.
That is such a bad idea. Like, there's a million reasons why that's a bad idea, but the most obvious ones are, you can now essentially pressure people into committing crimes that otherwise would not commit crimes, which is the entire reason that is prohibited. And you're going to end up with police getting vulnerable people like you described and or minor, young people, whatever, for whatever reason, to do things that they would never do. And they're going to end up in prison as a result. I can't believe that this passed. That is this is so dumb. I'm shocked to hear that.
It is extraordinary.
Stupidest new.
It is extraordinary.
Really, it is.
And
it really is dumb.
Many of us activists tried our best to get it stopped. I gave briefings to parliamentarians in the House of Lords. Did lots of meetings and briefings to try and explain that this was a really bad idea. I explained that from my point of view, that at the peak of my most manipulative undercover career, when I was most driven and most believing in the cause, I quite likely would have stepped much further over the lines than I did with this legislation in place. So, and there's certainly plenty of undercover cops less ethical than me. So, yeah, it's a terrible idea. It's an horrendous idea, but it's law now.
When you were doing undercover work, did you ever have to try the drugs? 'Cause it always seems to me like a dealer would want you to do the drugs with them or in front of them at some point. I mean, you can only make excuses for so long, right?
Well, not very often, thankfully. Thankfully, I never had to try heroin. That would have been terrifying. Never had to try crack. That wouldn't have particularly worried me. I used cannabis a few times.
You wouldn't have been as worried about crack?
No, not really. I tried cannabis a few times, but it's just cannabis, isn't it?
Well.
So what?
I live in California. That's outside the scope of what we're even talking about, in my opinion.
But I suppose, but there's two instances where I did particularly notable instances when I used drugs on an operation, and the first one was I'd been doing it for about 4 years. I went into this free party, the free party, which is like a rave party, but it's free.
Okay.
And it was this huge empty premises. And I was sent in by the drug squad because they said there were these big hitters coming, these big gangster dealers. And quite quickly, it was clear that there was no big hitter criminals there. It was just a room full of hippie ravers. It was a huge space with hippie ravers. And as soon as we went in, someone came up to us and says, "Hey, do you need some E's?" I said, "Yeah," and he just gave us 2 E's. I said, "How much?" He says, "Oh no, man, no, you can have them. Everything's free in here, man."
Yeah, have a good time.
Yeah. So my colleague and I, she said, "There's no way I'm gathering evidence against him. Just no way. I'm just not doing it." I'm thinking, you know what? You're right. Let's not. So what should we do? Well, let's just enjoy it, and then describe some just describe anyone. Make it up later. I says, "All right." I says, "All right then." And she says, "In fact, let's get stoned." I thought, what now? What? So we scored some skunk and some resin, and she very skillfully made a sort of double blunt thing, and so we spent the next.
This is your police colleague.
Yeah. So we spent the next sort of 3 hours dancing to some fantastic techno. I mean, really marvelous underground techno. It was brilliant. And then went back to the squad, and with the debrief, I thought, well, this is my undercover career gone. That's it, finished. Because we just looked completely out of it. Well, that's what I thought. But they didn't bat an eyelid. They didn't say anything. So my career survived. But a great fun night. But another time when I took drugs undercover, it wasn't quite as fun. And the reason for this is, and this is a really quite heavy job, because I was going into this pub, this bar, which was a meeting point between 3 major cities, where organised crime went into this village pub to meet. And there were some really vicious characters in there who were doing massive organised car thefts, antique burglaries, drug dealing, huge operation. And I made a terrible mistake. And that was that I made myself out to be a connoisseur of amphetamines, which I'm not. I'm not at all. But it just seemed to be something I could talk about. I could talk about Benzedrine, I could talk about refined methamphetamine or whatever. Anyway, the main target of this operation came up to me one day and he says, "Hey, you, I've got a present for you." And he held up this little see-through Sealy bag, and it had this rather toxic looking pink goo in it. And it, you open the bag and it smelt like the urine from a glue sniffing cat. You know, that sort of chemically nasty smell. And the trouble is, I must have had a moment of reticence flash across my face that he picked up on. You know, there's a high level dude. And I saw a moment's suspicion flicker across his face before he composed himself. And so I thought, we've got a bit of suspicion here. I am going to have to throw water on this suspicion. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to suddenly show a lot of enthusiasm. So I stuck my finger in this bag and got some of it, stuck it in my mouth. It's nasty. And he said, no, you're going to need more than that with your tolerance.
Right, with your tolerance. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, gosh. So I had another big scoop and put it in and swallowed it. And in no time at all, my stomach was starting to feel quite hot and I was starting to sweat and my heart was starting to go. Anyway, I made my excuses and I got out and I got to the team. I told them what had happened and they were all panicking and like, do we need to get you to a doctor? And I thought, well, no, I know enough about the stuff that I'm not going to overdose. You know, you need to take an enormous amount of amphetamine really to kill yourself that way. But it wasn't comfortable at all. I mean, this was anxiety inducing. So I had to be driven home. I remember on the way home, I was thinking I've got 8 cans of beer in my fridge and I can't wait to get that down. I'm thinking that's definitely going to take the edge off. And I remember being sat at home finishing the 8th can and feeling no different at all. Still like jaw clenching, like fist clenching, climbing the wall. And I didn't sleep at all for 2 nights and not much the 3rd night. That's how strong it was.
Oh wow.
The amphetamine at the time in the UK was on average 5% pure. This was 40% pure. And I'd had a lot.
Oh my gosh.
Mind you, my house has never been so tidy.
I was gonna say, man, you're probably all your closet had the clothing sorted by color and everything. Yeah. There's like, how did you get the grout so shiny? I used a toothbrush and a toothpick, my man.
Yeah, it was like that. Absolutely. Found myself polishing empty wine bottles. Like, why? Why would I do that? It's really strange.
Yeah. Oh my God. Not a speck of dust in the whole place. Could have made semiconductors in the kitchen. Yeah, that sounds really scary. So you had a whole bunch, and it was 8 times stronger than usual. So you had a massive mega dose. That was one of those, your mouth writing a check that your ass can't cash, basically. I don't know if you use that phrase over in the UK.
Not really, but I think I get that. Yeah, it's about right. Yeah.
Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show. I want to touch back on corruption because you mentioned that the drug squad, you had those confidentiality kind of isolation rules. It seems clearly corruption's just impossible to prevent, especially when it comes to drugs, because there's just too much money in it. Is that right?
Yeah, I would even go further actually and say that drug money corruption is impossible to prevent. It's impossible to fight against. If the drug markets were legally controlled and the finances were legitimate rather than illicit, then police corruption organised crime corruption would virtually not exist, because there is not enough money in the value of other criminality to corrupt our police and criminal justice systems like that. There just isn't. But it's not just the value in the market which causes the corruption. It's actually the mechanism of policing. But I mean, I came across corruption many times. Would you like me to mention a couple of those?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
So,
but let me, before you do that, you mentioned policing increases corruption. Is that because, let me just take a stab at this. If you bust, let's say, the Burger Bar boys, they might go away, but then the Johnson crew gets more business, so they're more profitable. They have more money to invest in protection and corruption. Is that one of the reasons why this
that's right,
increases as you police the issue?
Yeah, exactly. So once you're one step away from the street and upwards in the pyramid of the drug market system, then what policing more often than not does is it creates monopolies or cooperatives, and if anyone's watched The Wire, that is a perfect example of how it actually happens. You get cooperatives. It's a good defense against policing, but you take out competition, the person who's most likely to take up that gap in the market is a rival gang. So they increase their market share, they have more disposable income. And if organised crime have more disposable income, it will always be invested in corruption, always. And this pans out at every level all over the world, and there's some very famous examples. So, for example, in Mexico, there used to be 20 cartels, and now there are 3 cartels. And those cartels have a gross domestic product, a GDP, bigger than most West African countries. Those West African countries many of them are now narco states because transnational organised crime has completely taken them over. I'm talking about Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal. They've completely taken over because it's much more cost effective to take over an entire government than it is individual customs officers. And West Africa has become an important hub for the distribution of cocaine. Now, that is only possible because the mechanism of policing thins out the competition. It makes organised crime more efficient. It makes them razor sharp. Drugs policing, or put it this way, drugs prohibition is the mother of crime, and drugs policing refines the effectiveness in a sort of Darwinian way of organised crime.
That is an extremely important point, and also really, really highlights the hopelessness. Not that we needed more of highlighting of hopelessness, right? But that really highlights the hopelessness of policing the way that we currently police.
Yeah, because
unbelievable. Okay, so yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, because just to emphasise the point that really brings into focus the point I made about the fact that where the cops are really good at catching drug dealers, you can see that is really the problem, because the better the police are at it, the more that's superheated and speeds up the process. So, if you had more military, more weapons, more police, more doors kicked in, you're just speeding up that process. You are just superheating it. So not only are you creating monopolies, but of course you're also creating violence, because if you disrupt the market, you get more violence as well.
Violence is definitely something I want to touch on. It seems, of course, dealing with drug dealers in general is always going to be dangerous, but well, you know what? We'll touch on that in a second. I don't want to lose a track here. Tell me a little bit about the corruption that you saw with the police.
Okay, well, I'll give you two examples. One is I was doing an operation, and I've told you how cocooned and separate it has to be. Well, the intel officer at the end of one day, I just almost accidentally bought cocaine off one of the main targets in Leeds and Bradford. Leeds and Bradford is a big conurbation. It's one of the biggest population areas in the UK. And accidentally, right direct to the top, bought some cocaine off one of the big guys in his big BMW 4x4 thing. And so the intel officer was so excited. He says, "Oh, we could do so much with this. Let's get an obs point put out where we know he's hanging out. Let's get some corroborating evidence." And I'm saying, "No, hang on, no." And I got my cover officer to explain and put my foot down on my behalf. He was like my agent in the workings of it. I says, "No, don't do that. Promise me you're not going to do that." He says, "Oh, okay." I says, "Look, we're a cell here. We're a cell. We're a cell for a reason." This was on the Friday. The Monday morning, he was very sheepish. He says, "Yeah, I know you said don't do that, but I couldn't help just resist, like calling a mate on a proactive unit saying it might be worth you setting an observations part out." Anyway, this observation van was put outside this guy's house, near this guy's house. And after these cops had been in this observation van for a few hours, the balaclavaed men rushed to it, tied it with rope, poured petrol all over it, and set fire to it.
They set fire to the van with the police inside a few hours after it was there.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So
wow.
And funnily enough,
Did they survive?
They did survive. They managed to get out. None of them were injured, but obviously, the message was quite clear. And funnily enough, that main player disappeared. He changed his number instantly. He changed his car, and obviously the phone number that I'd so worked hard to get and the contact, that all just dead, all died. He broke the code. He went outside the bubble. This is going to happen. So, but there was another one. The operation for in Nottingham, the one with Cammy. The day after Cammy had introduced me to one of the lieutenants who actually interrogated me with a knife pressed into my groin, which is really quite off-putting, to say the least.
Yeah.
So
sure.
I'd been interrogated by him.
That's a good British way to put it.
And I include that just to show you just where my mind was at, because this was in the evening. But I managed to buy crack off him, and then the next morning I had an early briefing. And 2 of my backup team had gone off sick. So I was introduced to 2 new cops, and this is 4.5 months into an operation, which is unsettling as it was. I don't want to be meeting new people. I really didn't. But I met the first one, shook his hand, had no problem with him. The second one shook his hand, and almost literally the hairs just went up on the back of my neck. When you've been working undercover for that many weeks, 4.5 months by this stage, your senses are really fine-tuned. They're turned up to near paranoia level, and you're very, very sensitive to nuance in body language. And this guy was just wrong, really wrong. So I just went straight, didn't even speak to him again. I just went straight to the boss running it. I said, look, boss, there's no way I can trust this guy. I don't want him in the operation. I'm not going out on the streets. In fact, I'm ending it now if he's going to be part of it. And he was great. He says, yeah, no problem. We'll just run short-handed. They don't know anything about the job. They've not been in the briefing. All they've been told is to turn up this morning, and they might be here for a few months. That's it. So they were excluded. Now, I just put this out of my mind. I was reassured. I knew that he wasn't going to be there. I just got on with my job. But a year later, Nottinghamshire Constabulary, in a very brilliant job, not my job, an additional job, additional operation, they managed to catch this infamous gangster that I was trying to get close to, called Colin Gunn. And they caught the whole of the Bestwood cartel. At that point, they found out that the police officer that I'd taken exception to was an employee of the gangster Colin Gunn. He was part of the Bestwood cartel.
Oh, wow.
Now, he wasn't corrupted while he was in the police. He was paid to join the police. And he'd been in the police for 7 years by the time I met him. You can look him up. He was called DC Charlie Fletcher. And when he got sentenced, when the judge sentenced him, he said, I'm sentencing you to a year for every year that you were in the police. So he got 7 years in prison. But he was being paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses when he provided good information about what was going on. And in the debrief of that, now I'd come across corruption and the hints of corruption and things that really looks like corruption so many times that I shouldn't have been surprised. But, being that close to me, it's still shocking and unsettling. But in a debrief with the senior cops from EMSU, one of them said to me, well, Woodsy, look, we know this happens. Of course this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen? So it was clear to me then, as a senior leader of that covert police group, he was perfectly aware and accepting of that level of corruption as an inevitability from drugs organised crime. And, now I'm part of LEAP, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and the wider worldwide movement. I speak to police all over the world, and I spoke to senior police, and it's accepted everywhere. It's understood that this level of corruption is inevitable as a result of the drug policy regime that we have. But the trouble is, this might be understood widely by senior police within covert policing, in the covert policing world around the world. But this is something the public needs to understand, because if the public was better informed about that reality, I believe that we would have policy change quicker.
The corruption level, that sounds like the movie The Departed. Have you ever seen that movie?
It's a good film, but clearly based on more reality than most people give it credit for.
Yeah, no kidding. I would imagine through your career, there's been a few times where you've other close calls, right? I mean, I would imagine you having bought accidentally, however that happens, bought cocaine from the one guy, and they tried to light the surveillance van on fire. That could have been you, but have you ever I mean, you have to wear a wire and a camera at certain points. You ever had a close call with that? Because that's something you see often in Hollywood films is somebody having a wire in and talking their way out of it, or taking it off in the bathroom before because they have a feeling. Anything like that in your history?
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, yeah, the first time really, I did have my wire found. It was in Leicester, the city of Leicester, and it was right near the end of an operation. But I bought off a fairly big hitting gangster fairly early on in the operation, but he'd stepped away from the streets. He wasn't normally hands-on. But because it was near the beginning, I hadn't had any corroborative footage, because you don't wear a camera early. You wear it when you feel pretty confident that people have got to know you. They're not suspicious of you. So we need to get corroborative footage, and I kept phoning him up, trying to get to buy some product off him. But he would only send a runner, he wouldn't come out himself. So I thought, well, I know he's into his clothes, so I got hold of some counterfeit clothing, some counterfeit Stone Island jackets, which I was offered to sell him. And so he was interested in that, but he brought a couple of his gangster mates that I'd not met before. And they turned up, and we met in this secluded car park. Now, I say secluded, but it was actually really near the city centre of Leicester. But it was sort of like what we call the inner ring road. So it's like a dual carriageway, like highway, like a McDonald's nearby, and a big car park. And there was no one else in this car park, and we were right at one end of it. And he started looking at the jackets, and his mates trying them on, and he says, "Oh, are you just selling me these, or do you want something?" And I said, "Well, if you carry him white, I'll have a 20 off you." And he says, "All right." And he got this massive block of crack out, like huge, and he's peeling back the cellophane. It's like bigger than a VHS box, much bigger. I don't know, you're old enough to remember VHS, I'm not sure, but it was huge.
I am,
anyway.
yeah. It's funny you use that.
And he's sat. It's probably
like a book. It's like a book.
Like a book.
Kids,
yeah, it's like a book,
but sort of thicker, maybe a little smaller in other dimensions. Google it.
Yeah. So
TikTok it.
So he's sat in the back in the car, and he's trying to cut this little sliver, pathetic little piece of it off this massive block. But while he's doing that, his mate's suddenly looking at me, and he's looking at me really strangely, and he says, "How long have you known him?" I says, "I've known him months. I've known you months, haven't I, mate?" And then he suddenly pushed me against this fence. It's like steel triangular pointy sharp fence, big, it's like a security fence. Pushed me back against there, and he started feeling my clothes, and he doesn't have to look for very long, because I'm wearing like a denim jacket on, and my camera is actually in a little hole drilled in the metal button of a denim jacket. Now, this is 2001, and we're not talking James Bond tech here. Once he'd found that camera, there was no doubt what it was winking up at him. A little glistening sort of hole and a little, little gem of a camera in there. And he says, man, he's fucking heat, man. And at that point, now, one of the advantages I quickly realised that I had working undercover is that at the times when I thought I was going to die or I was in serious danger, my surge of adrenaline, which was inevitable, generally gave me a real serene feeling. It made time slow down, which had the sort of beneficial effect of making me feel like I had all the time in the world to think. And this was an advantage on numerous occasions, because I remember I could think, okay, what have I got to do here? What I've got to do is to stop him convincing him of what he's found, because he trusts me. So if I can prevent that communication, interrupt it long enough to get away, I might survive. So I launched into a torrent of abuse. I didn't give him any space to tell his mate. I just said, "What the fuck are you doing picking at my fucking clothes? What the fuck are you? Who the fuck are you?" And anyway, it's not even my fucking jacket. I borrowed it off Jackie this morning. It was like hanging off the back of the chair. So what do I fucking know about this fucking jacket anyway? And what are you doing picking at my clothes anyway? And I went on and on in this constant stream of abuse without giving him any gaps at all to allow him to explain what he found. It had the secondary effect of him really this not being what he expected. He was completely stunned by this onslaught. And you could see from the look on his face, he was actually starting to even doubt himself. Like, no, surely not. Cop's not going to do that. I mean, he's actually threatening me. I'm like 6'4" and built like a brick shithouse, and the saliva's hitting me as he's swearing at me. No, a cop wouldn't be that stupid, would they? Anyway, then I took the jacket as well, and I'm folding up this jacket as slowly as I can to make it look like I had all the time in the world, and I was putting it back in the cellophane all the time, giving it this shouting, this abuse. And I start walking as slowly as I can, thinking, well, if I run, it's like running away from a pack of wolves. They're going to follow you. So I just kept slowly shouting and walking really slowly. I got halfway across the car park thinking, wow, I'm increasing my odds of survival here. And then I hear running behind me, these footsteps. And I thought, all right, okay. I wonder if I just spin round and I get a punch in hard enough to the first one, and then I start running, maybe I'll get away. So I'm ready to hit him. And I come out, and it's the guy that trusts me. There's a guy I've known for months. He says, "Oh, don't mind my mate, he's a dickhead." And I says, "Yeah, he is a dickhead. Yeah. And he's been picking at my clothes, and I don't know what he's fucking on about." So he says, "Anyway, don't you want this ting?" And I'm thinking, no, you want to sell me crack now? So I got my 20 quid out of my pocket, and I gave him the 20 quid, and he gave me the stone. And at this point, his mate still stood at the car, screaming at him. He's saying, "Mate, he's fucking 5-0. I'm telling you, he's heat, man." And he's like just dismissing him and putting the 20 quid in his pocket. And I start walking again, and then he goes back, and then they're shouting and arguing. Now they're arguing, and I'm still walking. And then I hear the car engine go, and the wheels screech. I thought, okay, I don't need to walk slowly anymore, and I should start sprinting. But by this point, I've got almost to the exit of the car park, and I'm up to the highway, the dual carriageway, and onto the pavement, the sidewalk. So I turn left, I start running on the sidewalk, and the car came out of the entrance and started driving up the sidewalk behind me. I carried on sprinting, and I got to
driving on the sidewalk.
On the sidewalk, yeah.
So now you know they're after you if they're driving on the sidewalk.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt at all. So he's driving up after me, but quite near to it, there's a roundabout, a junction, and where the junction is, where the sidewalk meets the road, there's a steel railing. There's a railing to separate to protect the sidewalk. I just got to that point where there was no room for the car to go further forward, and it screeched to a halt, and I sort of glanced behind me, and I think the car must have been no further away than 2 meters. That's how close I was to being run down by them.
Ooh.
So I carried on running a bit, then I got to a crossing on the other side of the roundabout, and I saw the car go round and round the roundabout, again, just looking at me. It's going slowly. But by this point, I thought, well, they can't get me now unless they get out of the car and start sprinting. So I went back to a walk, and I still sort of acted out, like, I don't know what you're on about, like looking at my clothes and staring at it like, what's he on about, But from there, it was actually easy for me to get to the pedestrian area, which was in the very centre of the city where no cars could go. And from that point, I managed to get away and get back to the safe location. When I got back to the safe location, I did the debrief. I told the intel guy the description of the other gangsters, the number plate of the car, the make and model. And he went away. A couple of minutes, he came back. He was laughing. I says, "What are you laughing at?" He said, "Well, I don't know why they didn't just shoot you, because we've got loads of intelligence. They've got a gun in that car." And, we all laughed. We pissed ourselves laughing at that. And it just seemed like the funniest thing in the world, that they could have just shot me instead of trying to run me over. But, that's where humour becomes the cushion,
Yeah.
and after those moments.
Jeez, do you think they thought maybe I shouldn't shoot a cop. But then again, they were trying to run you over with a car, so I don't know. I don't know if the logic stands.
Well, I remember when we did finally have some training to work undercover, we had what we called the level 1 undercover people, the people who do high-end stuff. And they were teaching us all about the stated cases, all of the legality and all of the technical stuff that we needed to know. And one of them, who I eventually got really friendly with, said to me, I think you're all fucking nutters. There is no way you would get me doing the job that you're doing. There's just no way I would do it. Because of what I've got backup, I've got backed up legends for a year before I do my work. And all of the people I'm dealing with, they're all dead civilised. They're not stupid enough to murder us if they find us. But the nutters that you're dealing with on the streets, they'll kill you because they're either stupid or reckless. And, that's the point, that at that level where you've got that Darwinian thing going on, which has been created by drugs policing, it's the most ruthless and violent that survive. And we are literally teaching our young men how to be more ruthless and violent. And so this makes it perpetually more dangerous for everyone on the streets. And that's not just, and it's a point that's worth pointing out that, it became more dangerous for me, but actually it was my presence on those streets which made it more dangerous for everyone else.
Is that because I think I heard you say that violence is like an insurance policy? Because if you get arrested and you're going to rat on the person who you are least scared of, not the guy who's going to peel your skin off with a hot knife, but the guy who's maybe just going to like slap you around or threaten you and doesn't have a reputation for being a complete psychopath.
Yeah, exactly that. Exactly. Now, the intelligence war is the most important part of the war for policing. The police informants are the most important tool in this thing. But the use of police informants, that obviously organised crime know that the police use them. That's what's created this situation. So, you build up the reputation, so you're not the first person that gets grassed up. You actually take time to torture people to create that reputation. There's a famous gangster in the UK. One of the people he suspected as being an informant, he got witnesses. He caught him. He made him drink petrol. He taunted him, locked him in the boot of the car, and then set fire to the car. No one's grassing that man up. No one. But that currency of fear has been created by the police use of informants. And that's something we need to be seeing it in those terms. We need to be framing it in those terms and stop treating what the police do as a success, because look at the carnage in the wake of these arrests. Look at the carnage in the wake of those drug seizures.
When you're on these operations, do you have any sort of panic button for when you get in a tough situation? It doesn't sound like it, because you would have used it with the guy who you were selling Stone Island jackets, which, by the way, I Googled. They look really nice. Do you have any way to get back up, or is it just they're far away from you and so it doesn't help?
Well, theoretically in the rules, we were meant to have backup and backup where they could get to you. But the trouble is, at the beginning of any operation, I would make it very clear to my backup, I don't ever want to see you. I don't want you anywhere near me. In fact, I don't even want you at all. No disrespect. And, I don't want you, because to me, my biggest risk was my backup doing something which was out of my control. So I didn't want them nearby. But for some operations, I had an open mic. My phone was set with some technical equipment so that it also became an open microphone, so that I could call for backup like that. I remember for the pub job that I ended up having to take amphetamine, the signal for that was I would find an ashtray. You could still smoke in pubs then. I would find an ashtray and chuck it through the nearest window or through the front window, because there was an observation point on the front of that. So there was sometimes signals, but for the most part, I was on my own. And despite having got myself into more near-death experiences than I would care to start listing, I still felt safer with the backup being far away, to be honest.
I bet, yeah. Especially if they're going to do stuff like, well, you mentioned the corruption and the guy who had to call his friend and set up the observation point and all that. I mean, it's just, at that point, it's like you don't even really want the risk. They just add risk to the operation more than they add safety, from the sound of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I preferred to work on my own. and I just didn't want anything that was out of my control. I didn't want anything to do with. Although I did work with some brilliant other operatives. The best were always women, but I much prefer to work on my own, just because not having to think about someone else is a bonus. You know, thinking on your feet is a second thing to do. You know, you don't want to start second guessing someone else's behavior.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point I hadn't thought about. Tell me, speaking of violence, tell me about the guy, the samurai sword guy. This is such a ridiculous story.
Yeah, this is again, this is quite early on. This was within my first 4 years, and it was in the city of Stoke-on-Trent, which is a Midland town, very deprived, post-industrial, lots of two up, two down, sort of working class type houses. And I'd been buying heroin off this guy, and weights of heroin, you know, decent weights of heroin for a few weeks. And I remember calling on him one day, and the intel guy said, yeah, he's been wandering between his addresses. He had 4 different addresses he was operating from. He's been wandering between addresses with a samurai sword. And I thought, wow, that's fine. I'm going to knock on his door. He's used to me. Anyway, I knocked on the door, and to set the scene, this 2 up, 2 down, very working class, old-fashioned English house. There were 2 stone steps up. So when I opened the door, he was taller than me. He was further up. I was looking up at him. But as soon as the door opened, he put this samurai sword to my throat, and he's screaming at me. I mean, his face was blood red. He says, "You're fucking drug squad. You're fucking drug squad. You're he. I know you are, man. I know you are. I've got you." And he steps closer to me, and the sword's closer, and I could feel it on my throat. And honestly, I thought this was it. I'm going to die. It wasn't just the sword. It was the expression on his face, his body language, the saliva flying out at me. And then this woman sort of popped her head out behind him. I just saw her head, and she started laughing. She says, "Ha, I thought he was going to say he was then. I thought he was going to admit it." And she was pissing herself laughing. Then he started laughing. And yeah, he was just joking, or maybe he just wanted to try out his new sword or something. I don't know, but yeah, he was joking. I mean, but then, you know, was he joking, or was it just his routines about developing his reputation and intimidating his regular customers? Remind me who's boss, whatever it was. But
jeez.
Anyway, then I ended up having a sort of argument with him as well, because I said, "Well, have you got half a tea? I just want a reasonable little weight of heroin." He said, "No, I haven't got anything like that." And I had to argue with him about the deals I wanted, and I ended up walking away with 4 £10 deals, which had been hard work to get. And I started putting them in this cigarette packet. And as I look up, there's this guy in front of me, and he's got a knife pressing into my, well, not actually touching me, but it's pointing towards my stomach. He's trying to rob me for the heroin I'd just bought. So I thought, oh God, talk about frying pan and fire.
In front of the house where you bought the heroin?
About the length of 4 cars. So really close to it.
God.
So, and I just looked up and I thought, no, there's no way. And after what I just gone through for this heroin, there's just no way you're having it. So I sort of started running backwards, as fast as I could, as I was still putting it in the cigarette packet and grabbing it. And he was struggling a bit. He wasn't very well. He was an unhealthy, problematic heroin user, and thankfully I could run faster than him. But as I started running away from him, he says, no, mate, just hang on a minute. Come here a minute. I'm thinking, what? No, no, I won't. So I ended up sort of running and a bit reminiscent of the sofa, actually, from earlier on in my career. Sort of a little bit of go to and fro him the other side of a car, you know. But then again, I just sprinted and he couldn't keep up with me.
But come here, man. I just want to stab you for drugs. Just come over here real quick. This is so ridiculous, man. At what point, with the samurai sword up to your neck or a knife at your belly getting robbed of the heroin you just bought, are you thinking, well, this was a shitty choice of careers?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, though, at that point in my career, I probably had been doing it for 3 years. that was just a real buzz. I mean, I got back to them to the debrief, to the safe location, and yeah, I'd had a, I could have died, but I was buzzing, and at that point, I was loving developing in the role. I was loving getting better at it. I was loving that sort of personal sense of development where you're improving really rapidly, and that's a very heady thing to experience for whatever you're trying to develop. And also, I was developing this reputation of someone who could deal with that kind of thing calmly. And as a young man, that really boosted my ego. It was sort of boosting my sense of self, and I was enjoying that. It was a heady experience, and it was before I was having the true doubt. It was obviously a long, long time before I would realise how much damage that was doing to my mental health. I had no idea at all.
You're just wired differently than me, I think. Although now I'm 40 something, so I would say, because at that point, me now, 43-year-old man, if that happens to me, I'm thinking I should have been a mailman. That's the thought that's going through my head. I'm not buzzing, right? I'm thinking this was a bad time. Oh God, the idea that being undercover is stressful. Maybe the stress is different. Right? It seems like it's already a very lonely experience. And it's even more lonely because the police you worked with could only know your cover identity. You can't even bond with or fraternize with the police you're working with because they don't even know who you really are. Were you able to balance a family life and relationship with, do you have kids or anything? Or are we sticking with cats for now?
No, I've got 3 cats now, but yeah, I've got 2 kids. And at the time,
okay,
after 1997, I had kids. So in the early 2000s, when I was doing long-term work, I would arrange my cover story to give myself time and, do my best to get home every Sunday and take my kids swimming on a Sunday morning, which was a peculiar shift of pace, especially when I was doing jobs like the Nottinghamshire one or the one with the Burglar Boys. It was an amazing sense of stress relief. But did I balance it adequately? I don't know. The trouble is, I also had an abusive relationship. My wife was abusive, so that didn't help at all. And so, as peculiar as it sounds, at some low points, it was an escape to get away and stop, go and buy crack from gangsters. So it was an odd time, but I did do my absolute best to see my kids, and I would spend a lot of time, reading them stories at bedtime. It's just that when I was doing very long deployments, that same book would last quite a long time that I would be reading them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, right? So you're reading 4 pages per night, but you only get 1 night a week. It takes 2 months to read a book. You forget the beginning by the time you get to the end.
Yeah, but then
there's probably a metaphor. There's probably a metaphor in there somewhere for later. But I'm coming up dry right now.
Yeah, but I did have long breaks in between a lot of the long operations, so that helped with the balance, I think.
Ken Croak, episode 673. He was undercover with a biker gang, an outlaw biker gang, and he was talking about the stresses of having this stuff bleed into your home life. And he was married to another federal agent, so it wasn't even the lack of understanding. It was just the fact that he would come back after being at a meth binge party where he didn't do the drugs, but I mean, you come back stinky after riding a motorcycle across country with a bunch of thugs, and you're just a disgusting kind of guy who's been around disgusting people, and you have to compartmentalize all that and be a dad to 2 hopefully normal kids and go to the zoo or whatever. And it's just it's very difficult. He was talking about the difficulty of balancing that, the almost impossibility of balancing that. I know we're running a little bit low on time. I would love to talk a little bit about the effects that this has had on you. You mentioned mental health problems from the work. What does that entail? Did you feel it coming on at the time? Is that hindsight?
No, I mean, I didn't feel it coming on at the time. And now I realise that all of those near-death experiences, at gunpoint and the samurai sword to my throat, they've had an impact. But the biggest thing for me is this profound sense of guilt, the harm that I've caused to other people because, I made a conscious decision to keep doing it, even though I had doubts. So I'm diagnosed with complex PTSD, and one of the complexities is that I have moral injury. That's a facet of my problems. But no, it didn't start really. I didn't have a problem until about 2010. My world started collapsing. I didn't understand why I was feeling the way I was, confused, brain fog, hypervigilance, and it just went really downhill. A real crisis. And I've been up and down since I escaped my marriage, which helped. But I went downhill. I've had all of the counselling, tried all of the different medications. None of that's really helped. But I'm in a fairly stable, comfortable place at the moment. And part of that is because I manage my time well, and part of that is in my activism. I'm active, and I'm doing something positive to try and deal with the harms that I've caused, and that is really useful for me to do. But sometimes though, I overdo it and work too hard, and I can have a really low collapse. I've had suicidal ideation, but 2018, and all sorts of nasty spirals to go down. And it can, some days and some weeks can be an incredible struggle. And, when you have those attacks of hypervigilance and a sudden attack, it's bizarre because the fear that I feel from my mental health damage is much more extreme than the fear I felt during the events that caused them. It's like, it's much more. It's like a tiger's just jumped out and about to eat me kind of fear. I didn't feel that level of fear when I was with the Burger Bar Boys. So it's much worse from the mental health. It's the brain is a very complex and fascinating thing. What can I say? But again, I must apologise to you because I've put you off because in December just gone, I wasn't capable of stringing 2 sentences together because I was in a very, very low place indeed, to be honest.
Well, it's been worth the wait. I'll tell you that. And I'm glad that you are out of that funk, at least for the time being. I mean, no apology necessary. It seems like this kind of work, do you always feel like you're in danger, or are you able to relax at some points? I mean, you mentioned not feeling that kind of fear when you're with the Burger Bar Boys, but surely there's some fear. Or for me, I'm not sure I would ever be able to relax. Maybe relaxing is what gets you injured or killed in the first place.
Well, at the start of the time when I did the Burger Bar Boys operation, I'd already experienced several instances of obvious corruption, including the one that I told you about. I didn't trust anything around me. I didn't trust anything. And I was going into this operation because I thought it was the right thing to do to catch these gangsters, but I didn't trust anything. And so I had my own way of sticking 2 fingers up, or sticking the middle finger up at the universe. And that operation, I used my real name as a pseudonym. So I went by the pseudonym of Woody, which is almost my real name. And I did that just as a fuck you to the universe. And that's an idea of my mindset at the time, because I thought I can't trust anyone around me. I can't. It's clear just how dangerous this operation is, and I'm in more danger from the corruption that is endemic than I am from the gangsters on the street. So that was my way. It was my bravado sort of forcing my way to do it. But for that operation, whereas earlier in my career, I would be able to relax and feel relaxed in everyone's company and, manage the risks and not feel in fear all the time. For the Burger Bar Boys operation, I felt in fear on almost every day. So it was exhausting, really, because I felt fear, and I was pushing through that all the time. And, and I had many instances during that operation to reinforce that fear and remind me that, I'm risking a lot here.
What was the breaking point for you where you decided that maybe you were the enemy after all and not the hero in the story?
There were so many of them. There's so many of them. And the trouble is they built up incrementally. So when I forced myself to face up to all of my doubts, it came like a tide. They're all at once. I'd been pushing them down, and every vulnerable person that needed help that I'd manipulated, every every time that I'd carried on going despite my own doubts just hit me like a ton of bricks. But I suppose the instance really was in the town of Brighton, where the Brighton had the highest drug death per capita in the country. There was huge numbers of drug deaths from heroin, and the drug dealing gangs there, which were from Liverpool and London and Birmingham, and they were in competition. They were using the street homeless population as proxy dealers. But the word on the streets was that they, people, some of the people who were dying were actually being murdered. They were being given a dodgy dose to kill them, because these gangs were saying, look, you're the nominated person. You're the only person that comes to deal with me, and you deal to everyone else. So you're the only person. And if I can even see anyone at all when I deal to you, I'm going to kill you. And there was so many instances of people who were the nominated dealers ending up dead. And everyone on the streets was convinced that there was being casual murders happening. And, when I raised this concern and I told them again and again, this is what people were talking about, and then another person I'd met was found dead, the attitude of the cops that I was working for was, yeah, well, it's just another junkie, isn't it? Or maybe shoplifting will go down today, And it was quite clear to me, and I'm not saying this about all of the police I work with, because there were many cops I worked with who were very kind and very professional and very considerate. But the attitude amongst those particular cops was horrendous. It was a bullying atmosphere. They tried to bully and intimidate me. And whereas in complete and stark contrast, many of the people that I was getting to know on the streets were fascinating, thoughtful, kind people who just needed some real help. And that contrast was astonishing. It was dramatic. And that was the last straw for me, really. The insensitivity, the apparent deaths, the refusal to even consider the possibility that it might be criminal acts causing these deaths, and just the sheer inhumanity, really. And I knew then that I had to do something about it. I had to try and do something about this somehow. I mean, it was a few years before I found LEAP. I realised before I found that there was an international organisation of people just like me. But at that point, I knew I had to do something.
The effect of prohibition was to create new drug users. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because it doesn't really make sense when you first look at it until it's explained, right? It seems like prohibition puts things underground. Okay, maybe things are harder to get. Maybe they become more expensive. But how does it lead to more people using the drugs, especially in the UK?
Okay, so in our history in the UK, we had a system of drug policy, which was the opposing worldview to the American version. It was called the British system, capital B, capital S. And the British system held its own for a long time. But the American system was that you should treat addiction as a moral failing and criminalise those people who were addicted. The British system was, if you developed a problem with drugs, you went to a doctor and you got some help. Fairly simple, but opposing views. And the British system was entrenched and it worked. Then the Second World War happened and America became the true superpower because America bankrolled the UK's war effort. And we only paid that war debt off in 2015. But that meant that US policy became dominant in every regard, and that includes drug policy. And it's the reason that every country in the world now has the same drug laws, because it's dictated by US policy. So the British system died with the Single Conventions in 1961. But the British system, it's lasted a few more years, and it lasted until the end of the 1960s, where the doctors were shut down, everything was criminalised, we had the Misuse of Drugs Act. And at the point that, if we talk about just heroin, at the point that the British system ended, there was only 1,046 heroin consumers in the UK. And the number was falling. It's falling. Doctors were shut down. The market was handed to organised crime. And in less than 15 years, we had 300,000 heroin consumers.
Oh, wow.
We caught up with everywhere else that we hadn't had the problem before. You know, the US had hundreds of thousands in the 1920s, whereas we measured ours in the hundreds in the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. We went suddenly caught up with the USA. And we had all of the organised crime and the crime wave that came with it, all the associated problems. Now, the reason for that is if a doctor is controlling the supply of heroin, there is no incentive to find new customers. There is no financial incentive at all. There is only the incentive to take care of the health of the customer sat in front of you and to see what else that person might need. As soon as the market's handed to organised crime, then there's a massive business incentive to find new customers. Now, there's no shortage of people out there in emotional pain. And for those people with emotional pain, heroin can be quite a useful thing. But the greatest tool that organised crime will use is they will exploit what we call user dealers. Someone who has developed a habit and they'll be encouraged to develop a habit big enough to suddenly need more money. So then they might commit crime and they'll be exploited that way. Or they'll be encouraged to find 5 new customers. Because if they look, if you can find 5 new customers, that'll pay for your habit, and I increase my market, yeah. And that's what happens. That's the business model. It's a pyramid. It's the ultimate pyramid selling.
It's like multi-level marketing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
but it's facilitated by the fact that people in emotional pain will find it addictive. And I must emphasise, 25% of people who use heroin have got a problem with it. That means that 75% of people haven't. It's much higher.
Does that mean they're like casual users? Is that what that means?
Yeah. It's obviously much higher than other drugs. For all the other drugs, it's about 10%. For most drug use, 90% of people who use drugs don't have any problematic relationship with it at all. The 10% that do, it's a sliding scale. Some people need more intervention than others. It's the same for alcohol. So the idea of criminalising all those people, it makes a nonsense of the need to criminalise, and that criminalising doesn't help anyway. But so the UK history, as regards the end of the British system, is a very clear piece of evidence of the disaster, the catastrophe of drug prohibition, and the fact that it just creates incentive for more problematic use.
Neil, this was incredible and well worth the wait. Thank you for being so open and vulnerable, man. You're a hell of a storyteller to boot. And I really want to thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it. I know the listeners appreciate it. Just really, really fascinating. And I hope to meet you in person one day. I think this is really just a knockout episode.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on. It's been lovely to meet you over this computer screen. Apologies again for messing you around with the scheduling, but great. We got to chat eventually, and it's genuinely been really nice meeting you.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There, we dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off camera, off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find The Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, and subscribe.